Thank you very much, Carl. Before I begin, I want to express my appreciation to Carl Weiss for his magnificent logo and to Steve Jones for all of his contributions and for serving so long and faithfully as co-chair of scholars, and to Kevin Barrett for all of his good work. I owe these gentlemen a great debt. Now we're here discussing accountability. We need the slide connection. We're here discussing accountability. Accountability involves praise and blame, punishment and reward. It presupposes responsibility. Responsibility in this case entails a certain form of causation. It entails human causation. When Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern and started the Chicago fire, there was no one to praise or blame. And it entails intentionality. If I trip carrying a plate of hors d'oeuvres at our party, my wife may be furious with me, but in some sense I wasn't responsible because it was an accident. So what we need then is a theory about causation. Who was responsible? And here's where science can make a difference. Now, it's terribly ironic that there are divisions between Steve and me, for example, over the science of 9/11 for the following reason. In principle, the conditions of scientific reasoning are so objective that any scientist or student with the same hypotheses and the same evidence, using the same rules of reasoning, should arrive at exactly the same conclusions about which hypotheses are acceptable, which are rejectable, and which should be left in suspense. And what that suggests is that we must have a difference between us, either over the rules of scientific reasoning, or over the alternative hypotheses under consideration, or having to do with the evidence. And I'm going to explain to you where I think our differences lie, so that you'll understand that it isn't a vast difference between us, but it's an important difference between us with regard to the range of hypotheses that deserve consideration, where we may even reach an agreement, regarding the rules of scientific reasoning, which I'm going to enumerate now for your benefit, and finally about the evidence, where we may have some differences about which evidence qualifies as most important, or even over some of the authenticity in some of these cases. After having done a huge amount of research on JFK, I am very sensitive to the potential for manufactured evidence. Not just a lot, but most of the evidence in the JFK case is manufactured, it's phony, it's fake. And the hard part about the case has been sorting out the authentic from the inauthentic. So I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to give you a brief thumbnail sketch of where I think our differences may lie, and that we'll have the opportunity this afternoon at a second session to go into these matters in further detail. But insofar as Steve is following me, he'll have the opportunity too, if he should so elect, to comment on anything I've had to say. So here we can consider the full range of alternatives. Science begins with puzzlement. Something doesn't add up or fit into your background knowledge, such as the collapse or destruction of these buildings, the timing involved, the peculiarities about the whole scenario. Speculation is the second stage of science. We have to consider the full range of alternative explanations. These can include natural causes like earthquake, hurricane, tornado, human causes, conventional, air crashes, jet fuel fires, dynamite, RDX, thermite, human causes, unconventional, mini nukes, atomic, hydrogen, micro, directed energy weapons, HAARP, lasers, masers, plasmoids. And then you need a catch-all hypothesis. Maybe you haven't actually figured out the full range of alternatives. So you need another H4, other alternatives not yet considered. Now, it's terribly important to lay out the full range of possible alternatives. If you fail to do that, then you may, even as you proceed by a process of elimination or evaluation on the basis of the available evidence, have excluded the true hypothesis. In some cases, this can be deliberate. When I investigated the death of Senator Paul Wellstone, I discovered the NTSB only considered accident-compatible alternatives. The plane, the weather, the pilots. The NTSB never considered non-accident compatible alternatives, such as a small bomb, a gas canister, or a directed energy weapon. It did none of that. The public was conveyed with the impression of a thorough investigation, but they excluded all the non-accident compatible alternatives. Then in relation to these hypotheses which specify causes, you have to figure out what's the probability of the evidence as an effect of those hypotheses as causes if you assume those hypotheses are true. But you're also making an assumption about the evidence, to wit that the evidence available is authentic, is true, is genuine. And on that basis, you can determine comparative measures of explanatory power for alternative hypotheses. And what's known as the law of likelihood says that when one hypothesis has a higher likelihood, given the available evidence, where the likelihood is equal to the probability of the evidence if the hypothesis were true, then it's a preferable hypothesis. Just because an hypothesis is preferable, however, does not make it acceptable. To be acceptable, it must be the case that all of the evidence has settled down, more or less points in the same direction. You're very familiar with this distinction in all the detective stories, murder mysteries you've been watching your entire life. When the police have a suspect, they think this guy did it, he's their preferable given the evidence, but they don't have enough evidence, it hasn't settled down in order to arrest and indict him and try him. So there's this distinction at work in an ordinary familiar context. I now want to review, ever so briefly, some of the crucial evidence that an adequate explanation must encompass. But I want to emphasize the following crucial point. I'm very much disposed to believe that multiple forms of causation were involved here. I'm very much inclined to believe some of the explanation may involve conventional means. But I'm also equally persuaded that some of the explanation must involve non-conventional means. And that's the part I want to explain to you why that seems to me an overwhelmingly important alternative to consider. Okay, first, look at the extent of the devastation. It was very selective. This is not the sort of thing a hurricane or a tornado would bring about, right? It's as though all and only the World Trade buildings themselves were targeted. And of course, there were 7 of them. Here's World Trade Center 6. Look at these very peculiar extractions, as it were, or devastations, very strange forms of devastation here. That's a tough one to explain. Or here's World Trade Center Building 3. Look at that gash. I've sometimes described it as though Paul Bunyan took a gigantic axe and whacked that building. Or look again at these strange kinds of incisions in various buildings. In the upper right, you have Building 6. Just below it, you have Building 5. If you were to do a closer analysis, you'd find there are more and more of these kind of surgical incisions. In 1983, I lost a kidney. And of course, when the surgeon took out my kidney, there was a vacant space. That's the case here. It's as though these were surgical extractions. And if you can look beneath the kind of mist that is covering the situation, a mist that may have an origin other than has often been proposed with the fires that were presumably burning, you find that there are many of these strange incisions, as it were, in these buildings. Plus, there are these multiple forms of have been referred to as toasted cars. There are some 1,400 toasted cars, some of which are as much as a mile away from ground zero. That's a hard one to explain. Consider these. They look like beer cans that were crunched up after a fraternity party. What is going to account for that? These are all part of what is known technically as the explanandum. The explanandum is the full range of the data or evidence that we want to explain. So we're going to have to encompass these phenomena